The Mapinguari has become one of the most popular and well-known cryptids. Usually thought of as a living ground sloth or a large ape, the cryptid is reported from the Amazon rainforest in South America. I have seen a lot of misconceptions about this cryptid, so I'm making a video to talk about some of them. I'm not trying to say that the Mapinguari is real or that it's a ground sloth, but just trying to talk about some of the errors I've seen online.
Dr. David Oren is a Harvard-educated research biologist working in South America. He believes that ancient legends about a creature called Mapinguari may be based in fact.
For a bit of an introduction, American ornithologist David Oren arrived in the Brazilian Amazon in 1977. He immediately began to hear stories of various forest myths. One of the most common of these was the Mapinguari, a sort of giant monkey with robust claws. To Oren, it initially appeared to be just another part of the folklore of the rainforest. For every person who claimed to have seen it, 4 mocked the idea that it could be real. Even the eyewitnesses thought it was a myth prior to their own experiences. The Mapinguari was a creature of the seringueiros, or rubber tappers, but even during the silver age of the rubber plantations, it wasn't taken seriously by others. By the time of Oren's arrival, the Amazon gold rush was on, and many of the first Mapinguari reports he heard came from gold prospectors and mine employees. Historian David Vieira, who had collected several sightings from gold miners while he was in charge of Serra Pelada in Para, told Oren about some reliable modern accounts. During his discussions with Vieira in 1988, Oren heard a first-hand Mapinguari sighting from northern Tocantins. This sighting made a light go off in his head, and he thought, this creature could only be a ground sloth. After this, he collected more than 80 first-hand reports from multiple states in Brazil. He also interviewed 7 hunters who claimed to have killed Mapinguaris. Now let's get into the misconceptions. One of the most common ones I've seen is that the Mapinguari is a cyclops with a mouth in its stomach. How could it be a ground sloth? The unknown animal, or cryptid, which witnesses and cryptozoologists call the Mapinguari, is not the cyclops of Brazilian folklore. While there are some people who claim to have seen the cyclops, the bulk of David Oren's 80-plus reports describe an animal, not a cyclops. According to these witnesses, the Mapinguari has long coarse hair, a horse-like snout but a monkey-like face, and very large hooked claws. It can move on 4 legs and on 2 legs, and it's a herbivore, supposedly being particularly fond of palm trees. The distinction between the mythical Cyclops Mapinguari and this unknown animal is not an invention of cryptozoologists. One of the earliest uses of the term Mapinguari is from a newspaper called Cruzeiro do Sul. In 1913, they referred to it as a generic giant man, but also described a distinct mystery animal, the macaco de boraca, a beast the size of a Newfoundland dog with long tangled bulletproof hair. They also said that it could rear onto its hind legs to the height of a man. In 1960, a local took issue with a newspaper stating that the Mapinguari was a giant man, instead claiming that the Mapinguari was really a sort of huge and horrifying horse-like animal. He said that the creature had recently been seen by men working on the road that would link Acre to Brasilia. The first known use of the word Mapinguari being associated with an unknown animal and not a giant man was around 1926, so the idea that the Mapinguari isn't a cyclops has been around for a while. In fact, it seems possible that people just used the name Mapinguari for multiple mysterious animals and creatures in the jungles of the Amazon. Kind of like how people use the chupacabra name to refer to multiple different cryptids. The second misconception is that the Mapinguari is too small to be Megatherium, and Megatherium is too large to survive undiscovered. Megatherium is the best known ground sloth, and it reached a length of about 20 feet or 6 meters. This led some people to question how a Mapinguari could remain undetected, but there were actually quite a few kinds of ground sloths, from the sheep-sized Nothrotherium to the Diablotherium to the elephant-sized Megatherium and possible even larger ground sloth fossils that haven't yet been categorized. David Oren never identified the Mapinguari as a Megatherium. It was usually described as being about the size of a human or a little larger, not the size of an elephant. His original theory was that it was a mylodontid sloth, mainly because of its bulletproof hide. Mylodontids are famous for their bone armor. After looking further into anatomical details, he switched to a megalonychid identity. Either way, we're talking about the possible survival of an animal that's not much larger than a tapir. Another misconception is that the Mapinguari has to have osteoderms. Osteoderms are the bony armor-like structures that were found underneath the skin of certain ground sloths. David Oren initially thought the Mapinguari was a mylodontid, as they had osteoderms. After further research, he changed his mind and instead thought it was a megalonychid. Now, megalonychids don't have any osteoderms, so how does that explain the Mapinguari being bulletproof? Some have pointed out that the Mapinguari seemingly mixes different species of ground sloth together. The simple answer is, the Mapinguari probably aren't bulletproof, at least not completely. Keep in mind that the stories of the Mapinguari being shot don't describe the bullets bouncing off or anything like that. They just describe the Mapinguari being shot, usually followed by the shooter fleeing. In one case, a guy shot at the Mapinguari multiple times before fainting. His father later found a trail of destruction leading away from the area his son encountered it at. Many animals, especially somewhat larger animals like the Mapinguari, can shrug off a bullet, at least temporarily. Since the hunters who claim to have shot one usually ran off afterwards, the animal could have either left and healed or died elsewhere. Additionally, the ground sloth's smaller cousins are very tough creatures. Naturalist Charles Waterton said that the sloth exists long after it received wounds which would have destroyed any other animal. It may be said, on seeing a mortally wounded sloth, that life disputes with death, every inch of flesh in its body. If the smaller sloths are that tough, the larger ones would likely be as well. Another point brought up is that ground sloths lived in savannas and steppes, not rainforests. Why would the Mapinguari be most often sighted in the Amazons then? Remains from the Pleistocene era of both mylodontids and megalonychids, as well as the large ground sloth Erotherium, were found in the Amazon region, as well as the Atlantic rainforest. Whether or not the Amazon was a rainforest or a savanna during the Ice Age is hotly debated, but some research on the subject indicates that at least the giant Erotherium, which inhabited the western Amazon, lived in a rainforest-like environment. Regardless of their habitat, ground sloths were in the Amazon region. Other ground sloths, like the Australonyx, seem to have inhabited Atlantic rainforest habitats on the eastern coast. In North America, Megalonyx also inhabited very wet coniferous forests, swamps, and marshes. Basically, ground sloths were a very large group of animals that lived in a bunch of places, including the rainforest or rainforest-like areas. Another thing people question, especially in regards to the debate over whether or not the Mapinguari is a sloth or a large primate, is how would a ground sloth pull the tongue out of an animal? One of the stories associated with the Mapinguari describes it pulling the tongues out of livestock. This has been used to suggest that it's not a ground sloth, but rather a giant monkey, since monkeys have hands which could actually be used to, theoretically, rip the tongue out of an animal. The problem is, the story isn't actually about a Mapinguari. The locals never attributed the attacks to a Mapinguari, but rather a different mystery creature. It was only later when a journalist who didn't live in the area attached the Mapinguari name to the attacks. Another question is, how would a creature as sluggish as a sloth evade discovery? Sloths are basically the modern-day mascot for being slow, and I think a lot of people are skeptical that a giant slow animal could remain undiscovered. But there's no evidence that ground sloths were, or are, as sluggish as the tree-dwelling ones. Modern xenarthrans, the group of animals ground sloths belong to, are capable of galloping quite rapidly. The giant anteater, for example, can go pretty fast. It's been calculated that even the very large Megatherium, when moving on its hind legs, could travel as fast as a briskly walking human. Megalonychid ground sloths stood on the soles of their hind feet rather than the edges, which might have increased their agility. The Mapinguari itself is described by Oren as surprisingly agile on all fours, being capable of moving swiftly and forcefully if threatened. Furthermore, almost all xenarthrans, even the giant anteater, are rarely spotted animals. Zoologist Ralph Wetzel, who discovered the Chicoan peccary, seriously believed that there could be an undiscovered but widespread species of tree sloth in the western Amazon. While a tree sloth is much smaller than a Mapinguari, it's also much more sluggish. The final point and question I see people ask is that, even if the Mapinguari is a ground sloth, why regard it as anything more than a folk memory? A number of cultures have stories about animals that went extinct long ago, but the memories of the animals were passed down from generation to generation. Now this is a matter of opinion, but it's worth looking at. It's even been claimed that the whole idea of living ground sloths is based on cryptozoologists misinterpreting anthropological speculation about folk memories. David Oren's theory that the Mapinguari was a ground sloth was inspired by a first-hand sighting he received from a gold miner. The miner himself didn't seem to be familiar with Mapinguari stories either, as Oren said the man was unable to imagine what it was. In 1993, Oren believed that the Mapinguari, if real, could only have gone extinct within the previous few decades due to the first-hand sightings he had heard. During subsequent expeditions, he reportedly heard its call and discovered Mapinguari tracks. The ground sloth theory was supposed to explain actual contemporary sightings of the Mapinguari, not folk stories that had been around for generations. Huge thank you to the Cryptid Archive for writing a bunch of this video. I'd also like to thank my patrons Timothy and the YouTube channel Wild World for their support. If you'd like to see more videos about cryptozoology, I'll link a playlist of them in the description. I'll also link my Patreon and other social media accounts there as well if you'd like to support me. I'd also like to hear what you think about the Mapinguari. Do you think it's real? Do you think it's still around? Do you think it's a ground sloth? Do you think it's a giant primate? Leave your thoughts below, as well as any other questions you may have. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.